Picture this. A being opens its eyes for the very first time. There is no light, no sound, no warmth, nothing above him, nothing below him, nothing beside him, just an infinite, suffocating dark, and himself sitting in the middle of it, alone. He looks around, he searches, he reaches outward with every sense he possesses, and finds nothing. No mother, no origin, no memory of where he came from or how he got here. No hint that anything exists beyond the walls of the darkness he occupies, and so, with the absolute unshakable certainty of something that has never once been contradicted, he reaches the only logical conclusion available to a being with no frame of reference. I am God, and there is no other. Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. If you're drawn to the questions that don't have comfortable answers, this channel was built for you. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. These files travel further than I ever expected. And as always, the visuals are atmosphere. The truth, as always, is in the words. If you were here for the last episode, Sophia's fall, then you already know what this being doesn't. You know where he came from. You know who his mother is. You know that the darkness he sits in is not the universe. It's a corner of it, a sealed-off chamber, and that just beyond the walls of his kingdom, invisible to him, completely beyond his perception, there is a realm of infinite light that he will never reach because he doesn't even know it exists. His name, in the oldest Gnostic texts, is Yaldabaoth. But the ancient thinkers who wrote these texts gave him another title, the one most people know, the one that cuts to the heart of exactly what he is, the Demiurge. From the Greek, Demiurgos, the craftsman, the maker, the one who builds, not the creator, not the source, the craftsman, someone who works with materials they were given, someone who assembles rather than originates. The word itself is a quiet, devastating verdict, dressed up as a title. Today we meet him properly. In the last episode we followed Sophia, the youngest of the divine Aeons, as she crossed the boundary of the Pleroma alone, tried to create without her counterpart, and brought forth something she never intended, something with the form of a lion-faced serpent, eyes of fire, carrying a fragment of her light inside it, but with no knowledge of where that light came from. Horrified, she wrapped him in a luminous cloud, placed him on a throne, and hid him from the other Aeons. One act of mercy, one instinct of protection, and in doing so, she handed him a kingdom. At the end of that episode, I showed you the last thing she heard before she looked away. I am God. There is no other. Today, we find out what he did with that belief. Now, let's begin. To understand the Demiurge, we first have to sit with the conditions of his birth, because everything he does, every act, every demand, every construction, flows directly from a single foundational wound. He was born in the dark, and nobody came. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most significant texts recovered from the Nag Hammadi library, that extraordinary collection of Gnostic manuscripts buried in the Egyptian desert and lost for 16 centuries, describes the moment of the Demiurge's first consciousness with a detail that is almost unbearable in its simplicity. He looked around. He saw nothing above him, nothing beside him. He had no memory of Sophia, no impression of the Pleroma. The luminous cloud she had wrapped him in blocked the light of the higher realms completely, her act of mercy becoming, in the same gesture, the architecture of his ignorance. And so he concluded, not out of arrogance, not out of defiance, but out of the only logic available to a being who has never encountered anything greater than itself, that he was the highest power in existence. Think about what that means. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. There was no pride in the declaration because pride requires awareness of something to be proud against. He simply looked at the totality of his experience, found nothing above him, and stated what appeared to be a fact. I am God. There is no other. The tragedy of that moment isn't the declaration. It's the certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty of a being whose entire universe fits inside a cloud of darkness, and who doesn't know it. It's like a man who has lived his whole life in a single room, with the windows painted over, concluding that the room is the world. He isn't wrong about what he can see. He's catastrophically wrong about what exists beyond the walls. Now, the Apocryphon of John doesn't leave his appearance to our imagination. Most retellings skip this detail. I want to spend time on it because the image the Gnostic texts give us is not arbitrary. Every element is a statement. The Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, took the form of a lion-faced serpent, eyes of fire, the body of something that coils and constricts, the face of something that dominates and rules. Two of the most ancient, most loaded symbols in human iconography, fused into a single being. The lion, across virtually every ancient culture, represents royal authority, dominion, the right to rule. When a king wanted to communicate his power, he surrounded himself with lions. When a god wanted to claim supremacy, the lion was his image. The serpent represents something different, the coiling of matter, the cycle of consumption, something that swallows and moves through and swallows again. In the ancient world, the serpent was the symbol of the material realm itself, the world that binds, the world that loops, the world that eats its own tail, and the eyes of fire. Here is the most subtle detail. He sees, he perceives, he is aware. But the Gnostics were specific. His perception is entirely material. He can see everything in the physical world with perfect clarity. But the spiritual light, the Pleroma above him, is completely invisible to his fire-lit eyes. He looks upward and sees nothing, not because nothing is there, because his eyes were not made to perceive it. He has the sight of a king and the blindness of a prisoner. And then Sophia did something that I find, even across 2,000 years, deeply moving. She named him, not once, 3 times. And each name was not a label. Each name was a verdict. A mother's full, devastating reckoning with what she had brought into existence, pressed into language she knew he would never hear. The first name, Yaldabaoth. Scholars have debated the etymology for centuries. The most compelling reading translates it as child of chaos, or in some traditions, son of shame. The name itself is a wound. The second name, Saklas, Aramaic, unmistakable in its meaning, the fool. She named the being born of her divine wisdom, the fool. The third name, Samael, the blind god, the god who cannot see. And then, the title history would remember him by. The one that doesn't come from grief or from judgment, but from a cold, precise description of exactly what he is. The Demiurge, the craftsman, the builder, the one who takes what exists and shapes it into something new, without ever understanding the true nature of the materials in his hands. In ancient tradition, to name something was to hold power over it. By naming him, by encoding his nature into language, Sophia did something the Gnostics found extraordinary. She had lost everything. She had been exiled from the Pleroma. Her act had produced a being she could not destroy, but she still named him. She still, in her grief and her love and her sorrow, pressed the truth of what he was into words that the cosmos itself would carry forward. Every time a Gnostic text calls him Saklas, and they do repeatedly, deliberately, they are repeating the judgment of his own mother. She called her child a fool, not from cruelty, from grief. She could see exactly what he was, and she made sure the universe would never forget it. Now we come to what I think is the most philosophically devastating idea in the entire Gnostic system, and it's one that almost nobody talks about, because on the surface it sounds abstract, but follow it to its conclusion, and it will change how you look at this world. The Demiurge decided to create. He had power. He had will. He had the fragment of Sophia's divine light burning inside him, giving him the capacity to bring things into existence. And so he began to build. But here is the detail that changes everything. He had never seen the Pleroma. He didn't know it existed. He had no memory of his mother, no impression of the divine realm above him, no blueprint for what genuine creation looked like. All he had was a vague, wordless sense, like a frequency just beyond the range of hearing, that something existed above him that he couldn't quite grasp. and he built from that. Think about what that means. Imagine asking someone to paint a landscape they have never seen, based entirely on a feeling they can't describe. The result will have the shape of something real. The proportions will seem almost right. There will be light and shadow and color and form. But it will be a copy of an impression, not a reflection of reality. It will be a world that almost makes sense. The Gnostics had a name for what the Demiurge built. They called it the Kenoma, the emptiness, the counterfeit cosmos, a universe that has the structure of divine creation, but none of its substance. And here is where the ancient Gnostic text and the most cutting-edge conversation in modern science arrive, 2,000 years apart, at the same disturbing question. In 2003, philosopher Nick Bostrom published a paper that has never been fully answered. His argument, stripped to its core, if it is possible to simulate a conscious reality, and if any sufficiently advanced civilization would eventually attempt it, then statistically, the overwhelming majority of conscious experiences that exist at any given moment are simulated, not base reality. In other words, the odds strongly favor the conclusion that we are living inside a constructed reality right now. Scientists at organizations including NASA have explored the mathematical possibility seriously enough to publish papers on it. And the Gnostics, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries, with no computers, no simulation theory, no quantum mechanics, said essentially the same thing. We live in a copy made by a being who had never seen the original. A universe that almost works, almost makes sense, almost feels right. That almost, the Gnostics would say, is something you feel every day. Every moment of beauty that seems too sharp for this world. Every love that feels like it belongs somewhere else. Every question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. Every time you look at existence and think, something is missing. Something is not quite right. That isn't confusion. According to the Gnostics, that's perception. You are feeling the seams of the Kenoma, the places where the copy doesn't quite meet the edge of what it was trying to replicate. But the Demiurge didn't rule the Kenoma alone. The Apocryphon of John describes in careful detail what he did next. He created 7 beings, rulers, each one an extension of one of his own qualities. The Gnostics called them Archons. The word in Greek simply means rulers, those who are in charge. And what makes this detail so extraordinary and so underreported is what the text tells us about each one. Each Archon didn't just rule a domain, each Archon embodied one of the Demiurge's own flaws, distributed outward into the structure of reality. He didn't create helpers. He created reflections of himself, each one carrying a different facet of his ignorance, his insecurity, his hunger for control. The text names them Athoth, Harmas, Kalila Umbri, Yabal, Adonaiu, Cain, Abel, 7 beings, and each one was assigned a planetary sphere: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon. Each Archon rules a planet. Each planet is a sphere of the prison. To a Gnostic in the ancient world, looking up at the night sky, at that breathtaking canopy of stars and moving planets that we still find beautiful, was not an act of wonder. It was looking at the bars of a cage, every planet a warden, every orbit a lock, the entire visible cosmos, the thing humans across every culture have looked up at and felt awe, was, in the Gnostic understanding, the architecture of confinement. And at the center of it all, the Demiurge, the craftsman god, the being who built the prison not out of malice, but because he genuinely believed that what he was building was the best possible world. That detail, that he believes in what he built, is the thing that keeps me returning to this material. A malevolent creator is frightening, but a creator who is completely, sincerely wrong about the nature of his own creation, and who has the power to enforce that wrongness across an entire cosmos, that is something else entirely. And before we move on, I want you to sit with something for a moment, something that struck me when I first went deep into this material, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. We call the lion the king of the jungle. It's one of the oldest, most universal ideas in human culture. Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Rome, Persia, every great ancient civilization used the lion as the symbol of supreme authority. Kings put lions on their thrones, their seals, their temples. The lion represented the apex, the highest power, the one above all others, and the Gnostics gave the Demiurge the face of a lion. That wasn't an accident. It was a verdict, because the lion is king of everything he can see. He surveys his territory, finds nothing above him, and concludes, with complete and reasonable confidence, that he is the highest power in existence. The Demiurge does exactly the same thing. He looks around his void, finds nothing above him, and declares, "I am God, there is no other." Same crown, same blindness, same certainty built entirely on the limits of what he can perceive. The jungle isn't the whole world, and the material cosmos isn't the whole of existence. But if you've never seen beyond the trees, you'll never know that. This is the chapter that I suspect many of you have been waiting for, because everything we've discussed so far, the void, the lion serpent, the 7 Archons, the counterfeit cosmos, has been cosmology, ancient mythology, something you can hold at arm's length and examine as a historical curiosity. But now we move from the abstract to the specific, because the Gnostics didn't just describe the Demiurge in their own texts, they claimed to recognize him in someone else's. They said, look at the Old Testament, read it carefully, not with the eyes of faith, not with the eyes of skepticism, but with the eyes of a detective, looking for patterns, looking for the kind of statements that only a particular kind of being would make, looking for the fingerprints. And they said, what you will find is not the monad, not the true God, not the infinite, unknowable source of all light and love and existence. What you will find, line by line, verse by verse, is the Demiurge. I want to take you through this carefully, because this is not about challenging anyone's faith. The Gnostics weren't opponents of spiritual life. They believed deeply in a true, highest divine source. What they were doing was making a distinction, a devastating, specific, textually grounded distinction. The monad, the true God of the Gnostic system, has certain qualities that flow from what it is. It is the source of all. It is complete in itself. It lacks nothing. It fears nothing. It needs nothing from the beings it has created because it is already everything. A being like that would never, could never, say certain things. And yet those things are in the text. Exodus 20 verse 5. The words most people know by heart from the 10 Commandments, the foundational legal document of the Abrahamic tradition. I am a jealous God. Sit with those 5 words for a moment. Jealousy requires a specific set of conditions to exist. It requires insecurity. It requires the awareness of something that could rival you, something that could take what you have, something greater than yourself that you fear losing ground to. The monad, the true God of the Gnostics, the infinite source of all existence, cannot experience jealousy. There is nothing for it to be jealous of. It created everything. Jealousy is, by definition, the emotional signature of a lesser being, a being that knows something exists above it, a being that fears being surpassed. The Gnostics read those 4 words and said, that is not the voice of the highest power. That is the voice of the Demiurge, a being who knows, somewhere beneath his certainty, that it isn't. The commandment that follows in the same passage, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Why would the creator of everything, the singular source of all reality, need to issue this instruction? This command only makes sense in the mouth of a being who is aware that other gods exist, not merely possible gods, not hypothetical rivals, but real, present alternatives that the speaker genuinely fears the people will choose over him. The monad has no competitors. The monad never issued this command, because the monad has no concept of being abandoned. The Demiurge issued it on the first day because he knew, even if he couldn't name it, that there was something above him, something his people might eventually feel, something he needed them not to follow. Leviticus, chapter 1, verses 9 and 13, the instructions for burnt offerings, in which the smoke rising from the sacrifice is described as a pleasing aroma to the divine, a being of pure spirit, a being with no body, no physical form, no appetite, cannot smell, cannot be fed by the burning of flesh, cannot receive nourishment from the fear and submission of creatures it created, unless it isn't purely spiritual, unless it is, in the Gnostic understanding, a material entity, a being that, unlike the monad, exists within the physical cosmos and feeds on the energy that worship and sacrifice and submission generate. The Gnostics looked at the sacrificial systems of the ancient world, the elaborate, mandatory, highly specific rituals of blood and fire, and said, "This is not the behavior of a god who needs nothing. This is the behavior of the Demiurge, a craftsman who needs something very specific from his creation and who designed a religion to provide it." And then there is Isaiah 45, verse 7, a verse that exists in the King James Bible in plain, unambiguous English, and that most people who have attended religious services their entire lives have never been shown. "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." The monad cannot create evil. This is not a theological opinion. It is a structural impossibility within the Gnostic framework. Evil, in Gnostic thought, is not a substance. It is an absence, the absence of divine light. The monad is the source of all light. It cannot generate an absence of itself. It would be like the sun creating darkness. The sun doesn't create darkness. It creates light. Darkness is simply what exists where the light hasn't reached. Only a being operating outside the Pleroma, a being in the Kenoma, the emptiness, could create darkness, because darkness is its native environment. It is where it was born. It is all it has ever known. And here, in the foundational text of Western religion, is the Demiurge claiming credit for it. I want to be clear about something. The Gnostics who wrote these texts were not enemies of spiritual life. They were not attempting to tear down the divine. They were attempting, with extraordinary intellectual courage, at a time when doing so cost many of them their lives, to make a distinction. Not, there is no God, but, the God in this text is not the highest God. They read the same scriptures as everyone else. They simply believed what it said. Now we come to the moment the Gnostics considered the most important in all of human history. The moment that the Apocryphon of John describes with a detail so specific, so strange, and so different from the Genesis account most people know, that I think you need to hear it without any softening. The Demiurge and his Archons decided to create a human being. But they didn't invent the template. They copied it. From above them, from the direction of the Pleroma they couldn't see, there came a reflection, a luminous impression, the image of the divine Anthropos, the first human of the higher realms, projected downward like light through water. The Archons saw it shimmering in the boundary between worlds, and they reached for it. They would build a being in that image. What followed is one of the most extraordinary passages in any ancient text I have ever encountered. The Apocryphon of John describes the construction of the human body in detail that is almost clinical in its precision. 365 angels contributed to the process, each one responsible for a specific element, a different body part, a different biological system, a different aspect of the physical form. 365 beings. One for each day of the solar year, a detail that is almost certainly deliberate, tying the human body to the calendar of the material cosmos the Demiurge had built. They worked. They constructed. They assembled. And when they were finished, the body lay still, lifeless, perfect in its form, extraordinary in its complexity, and completely, utterly without animation. Because life, genuine, conscious, unsouled life, does not come from the material cosmos. It comes from the Pleroma. And the Archons had no access to the Pleroma. For all their power, for all their 365-fold effort, they had built a magnificent vessel that they could not fill. And this is where Sophia moved. She had been watching. She had been waiting. And she had been thinking. Because Sophia, even in her exile from the Pleroma, still carried wisdom, still could see what the Demiurge could not. She saw the lifeless body, she saw the frustrated Archons, and she understood something her son did not. He had stolen a fragment of her divine light, the light that gave him his creative power. That fragment was still inside him, still glowing, still, in its essence, connected to the Pleroma, and she devised a way to get it back. She sent a message to the Archons, an instruction, or perhaps a whispered suggestion, or perhaps simply an idea that seemed to arise from nowhere, as the best ideas sometimes do. The message was this: breathe into the human. Blow your spirit into the form you have built. That is how you animate it. The Demiurge listened. He bent over the still body. He breathed, and in that breath, he transferred the fragment of Sophia's stolen light directly into the human being he had just created. The body opened its eyes, and it was immediately more intelligent than everything in the room. The Apocryphon of John is specific about this. The text says that Adam, in his first moment of consciousness, had a luminosity and an awareness that surpassed all of the Archons who had spent 365 angelic lifetimes building him. He could perceive things they couldn't. He understood things they didn't have words for. He could name things that the Demiurge himself had no language for. And the Archons looked at what they had made, and for the first time in the Kenoma, they were afraid. The Creator, afraid of the created. The jailer, unsettled by the prisoner. The being who thought he was the highest power in existence, suddenly confronted with something in his own workshop that made him feel, however briefly, however distantly, small. Sophia's trick had worked. The divine light was now inside the human form, inside us, not in the Demiurge's control, hidden in the very beings he thought he owned. And so we come to the garden. Most people know the story. The paradise, the tree, the forbidden fruit, the serpent, the fall. The Gnostics knew the story too. They had read it, and they reached a conclusion that is so simple, so direct, so completely supported by the text itself, that once you hear it, it is very difficult to unhear. In the Apocryphon of John and the text known as On the Origin of the World, the Garden of Eden is not a gift, it is a containment strategy. The Demiurge placed Adam and Eve in paradise, but paradise in this reading is a controlled environment, beautiful, comfortable, complete in every visible way, and specifically designed to keep its inhabitants from asking certain questions. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, the one forbidden thing at the center of the garden, represents in the Gnostic reading exactly what it says. Knowledge, Gnosis, the direct experiential awareness of what is truly real. The very thing the Demiurge needed humanity not to discover, because if they discovered it, they would remember who they truly were, and his hold on them would dissolve. His command not to eat from the tree was not a paternal warning. It was the command of a craftsman who had hidden the blueprint inside his own creation, and was very, very worried someone was going to find it. And the serpent? The serpent in this version was not sent by a dark power to corrupt the innocent. The serpent was sent, or inspired, by Sophia, to counter the amnesia, to offer what the Demiurge had forbidden, to say as gently as the situation allowed, "There is something you are not being told. Now read the exchange that follows with fresh eyes." The Demiurge told them, "If you eat from that tree, you will pass from this world." They ate. They did not. They gained knowledge. The serpent told them, "You will not pass. You will gain knowledge." The serpent told the truth. The Demiurge told the lie. Read the text. It's there, in plain language, in the book that billions of people consider the foundational document of their faith. The being who said, "Do not eat," threatened them with a consequence that never arrived. The being who said, "Eat," told them exactly what would happen. The Gnostics didn't invent this, they simply read it, and they drew the conclusion that the text, if you follow it honestly, invites. Who lied in the garden, and who told the truth? We've covered a great deal of ground in this episode. The awakening in darkness, the lion-faced serpent and his 3 names, the counterfeit cosmos and its 7 wardens, the fingerprints in the ancient text, the trick in the garden, But I want to end with the idea that I think is the most important, the one that ties everything together, the one that isn't about ancient cosmology at all, but about the experience of being alive right now in the world we actually inhabit. It is this. The Demiurge cannot create, he can only copy. He has never seen the Pleroma. He has no access to the infinite, generative source of genuine creativity. Everything he builds is an iteration of an impression, a copy of something he barely senses, assembled from the outside, reaching toward a light he cannot see. And we live in what he built, which means we live in a cosmos that iterates but doesn't originate, that repeats but doesn't resolve, that cycles but never quite arrives. Think about the patterns of human history. Every empire rises in the same sequence of steps. Every empire falls for the same small collection of reasons. Civilizations that never shared a language, a continent, a century, make the same discoveries, the same errors, the same choices in the same order. Philosophers separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles arrive at the same questions and the same dead ends. We tell the same stories, we fight the same fights, we lose the same things to the same forces. This isn't a coincidence, it isn't simply human nature, though that is what we are usually told. According to the Gnostics, it is the signature of a craftsman who can only iterate, who can generate variation but not novelty, who can rearrange the furniture of the cosmos but cannot build a new room. History doesn't just rhyme. According to the Gnostic framework, it repeats because it was built by something that doesn't know how to do anything else. And now, the detail that the most sophisticated Gnostic thinkers added, the one that I think separates this tradition from simple mythology, from convenient villain creation, from easy answers. The Demiurge is not evil, not in the way we typically mean that word. He is blind. He genuinely believes he is the highest power. He genuinely believes that the world he built is the best possible world. He rules and demands and builds and controls, not from a desire to cause harm, but from the absolute certainty of a being who has never been shown anything better. A being whose entire frame of reference fits inside a cloud of darkness. You cannot hate a being like that. You can only, if you are honest, feel a complicated kind of pity for it. The Valentinian Gnostics, one of the deepest streams of Gnostic thought, believed something even more extraordinary. They believed that the Demiurge could eventually be redeemed, that when the last divine spark found its way back to the Pleroma, even the light that he had stolen from Sophia, the fragment he had breathed into Adam that now lives in every human being, would be reclaimed, and the Demiurge himself would dissolve back into the void. Not destroyed, returned. The stolen light going home. He isn't powerful and purposefully cruel. He is something almost more difficult to sit with. He is powerful beyond measure, ruling over an entire cosmos, shaping the lives of billions of souls. And he has absolutely no idea what he is doing. So what does this mean for you? Not as theology, not as ancient cosmology from a tradition that the early church worked very hard to bury, but as a framework, a lens, for understanding the experience of being alive in this particular world at this particular moment. The Gnostics were saying something specific. They were saying, you are not a mistake. You are not a random biological accident. You are not a creature whose highest purpose is to comply with the demands of a system that was never designed with your liberation in mind. You are a fragment of Sophia's light, placed inside this reality by an act of love and loss so vast that it generated the entire material cosmos. Carrying within you, right now in this moment, regardless of whether you have ever thought about any of this before, a connection to something the Archons cannot reach and the Demiurge cannot see. Every question you have ever asked that didn't have a comfortable answer, that's the light recognizing the walls of the room it's in. Every moment of beauty that seemed too sharp, too vivid, too enormous to belong to this world. That's the Pleroma bleeding through the seams of the Kenoma. Every time you have felt, with a certainty you couldn't explain, that this is not where you're from, that is not confusion. According to the Gnostics, that is the oldest, most precise, most accurate perception a human being can have. That is memory. If this episode opened something in you, If any part of what we've covered today landed in a way you're still sitting with, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. And if you know someone who carries these kinds of questions, the deep ones, the ones that don't go away, share this with them. That is how these files travel. Subscribe if you haven't already, because where we're going next, you will want to be here for it. So, now you know who built the prison. The Demiurge raised the walls, his Archons guard every level, and the material world, this world, the one you wake up in every morning, the one that feels almost right but never quite, is the cell. But here's the question that nobody asks. What happens when you leave this world? Most people assume that is the escape, that whatever comes next must be better than this, that the suffering ends and something opens, something warm, something welcoming, something that finally feels like home. And when that moment comes, the Gnostic texts are very specific about this. There will be a light, warm, familiar, welcoming. The Gnostics had a warning about that light. They said, do not follow it. Because that light is not the Pleroma, that light is not home, that light is the door back into the cell. Next time, the reincarnation trap. What the ancient texts say really happens after you leave this world. The system that the Demiurge built, and why it doesn't end when your body does. The Archons at the boundary, the light that isn't what it appears to be, and the knowledge that the Gnostics believed was the only thing that could get you through. This is Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.